Grizzly bears are a household name for Magic the Gathering. They've been around since the very first set and have been a measuring stick for a particular kind of small green creature. As of this release, the card Grizzly Bears have not seen a reprint since 10th edition in 2007, but its name continues on. Let's go through the history of Grizzly Bears, from the original one in Alpha to the most recently printed comparable cards. Put together, these cards tell a story of a changing game, from a time when non-creature strategies reigned supreme to the intentional powering up of creatures today. Before we dive further, let's define what we mean by Grizzly Bear. A creature commonly referred to as a Grizzly Bear has an exact casting cost of 1 generic and 1 colored mana with stats of 2 power and 2 toughness. A 2/2 white knight, or even black knight, is technically not considered a bear even though their power, toughness, and converted mana cost match. The reason is the knight's mana cost. Since each knight has to commit 2 of its color in its casting cost, it doesn't fit what we'd like to call a standard Grizzly Bear. Another example of a creature that can be mistaken is Abbot of Carroll Keep. This creature's casting cost meets the requirement, but it's a 2/1 with a couple of added abilities. Because its base power and toughness is 2/1, it isn't a conventional bear. We only want to focus on creatures that have exactly 2 power and 2 toughness and only cost 1 colored and 1 generic mana. For over 20 years, Grizzly Bears have become the gold standard of 2-drops in Limited. During the early days of Limited Magic, players started prioritizing the importance of a mana curve, with the sweet spot mostly being at 2 mana. Since the 2-drop Grizzly Bears was the most optimal common creature in that slot, players deemed any creature at 2 converted mana cost a bear. This caught on, and even though we haven't seen a printing of the actual Grizzly Bears card in over 8 years, the name is still used to identify a 2/2 for 2. Of course, there were other creatures that competed for this coveted slot. Red had a creature similar to Grizzly Bears, but it unfortunately came with a drawback and never saw a reprint after 5th edition. As a matter of fact, Grizzly Bears saw several functional reprints before the other colors had their first direct copy of a Grizzly Bear. It wasn't until Portal in 1997 that a color outside of green finally got a bear of its own. For several years, Magic's power level in creatures was stagnant, but in late 2000, the set Invasion released and brought a huge change. To this day, Invasion is considered to be one of the greatest sets ever. It reintroduced multicolored cards and made an entire block out of that theme. Split cards were created, and more specifically, 2-mana creatures became powerful. Starting with the cycle of allied colored knights, Invasion also introduced the first bear with upside, Kavu Titan. This bear was instantly recognized as a card powerful for its time and would still be solid today. At this point, most of the other colors, except for white, still didn't have proper equals to Grizzly Bears. Black had Spineless Thug in the previous block, but it came with a major drawback. Red and blue each got a bear in Invasion, but both cards had significant downside that made them unplayable in competitive formats. Magic would continue this trend, often with restrictions to attacking or blocking for red, and no quality in sight for black and blue. White finally got another direct copy in Mercadian Masks in the form of Rebels, and a reprint of Knight Errant in 7th edition, but it still took until Mirrodin before White saw any bear with upside. Note that even at this time, cards like Nomadic Elf demonstrated that rarity correlated with power. Even if Nomadic Elf was better than a Kavu Titan when played as a 2/2, the Kavu was clearly a much more flexible and powerful card. In fall 2001, Odyssey was released and a cycle of 2-drop bears were printed at Common. With base stats of 2 power and 2 toughness for 1 generic and 1 colored mana, each color had its own hound. Red got the weakest of the bunch with Mad Dog. Black got Filthy Cur, a creature fitting for Suicide Black strategies of old. Blue had slightly less downside in Phantom Whelp with Pseudo Vigilance. White got the runner-up in Patrol Hound. And of course, green had the best hound of the cycle with Wild Mongrel. At the time, Graveyard and Discard were the premier strategies in Standard. Since the Wild Mongrel had an optional ability with a convenient cost of discarding a card, it ended up fitting perfectly in Blue-Green Madness decks. With its sidekick, Aquamoeba from Torment, the Hound was a formidable foe. Not only was the dog a powerful enabler for Madness and Graveyard strategy, it was also very hard to kill. Because its ability gave 1 additional power and toughness, plus a color of the controller's choosing, it was difficult for opposing players to kill even with the best removal spells available. For years after Wild Mongrel was printed, many Grizzly Bears with Upside were printed in green, but while not all directly comparable, no card had as much standard dominance as the Mutt. For a long time, Wild Mongrel was known as the best 2-drop ever printed. In the years since Odyssey, Magic has greatly evolved as a game. Creatures have gotten better, spells have gotten worse, and bears have gotten even stronger. White and green kept seeing more bears with upside, while the other 3 colors were still trying to catch up. One of the biggest players was Tarmogoyf. This sleeper card did not see a lot of success while legal in Standard, but Eternal formats showcased this card's full potential. Due to its ability to grow its power and toughness, Tarmogoyf is technically not considered to be a Grizzly Bear, but it did overtake the title of best 2-drop ever from the revered Wild Mongrel. Magic saw another huge change in creature power level when Magic Core Set 2010 was released in 2009. This revolution refined the fundamental rules, added more terminology, focused more on top-down design, and made core sets printed yearly. Creatures started becoming more powerful, bringing in even more new bears. Unfortunately, one of the victims of this change was the actual Grizzly Bears card, which did not receive its first ever core set appearance and hasn't to this day. On December 5th, 2011, Magic lead designer Mark Rosewater released an article titled New World Order. In this announcement, Mark stated the game was becoming too complex and that in order for it to flourish, they needed to simplify the game. One of the major changes was to reduce the complexity in common cards. Because of this new structure, more bears were printed, including Black's first bear, Walking Corpse. In the last 2 years, we've seen the printing of Grizzly Bears with the greatest upsides yet. Heir of the Wilds was an excellent aggressive threat in many green-based standard decks. Herald of the Pantheon was a sweet enabler for competitive fringe decks and kitchen table decks alike. Dwynen's Elite found a home in both modern and legacy elves. And even Snappy Gnarlid had its day in Teamer Battle Rage combo. White saw an exponential amount of bears with upside too. Seeker of the Way saw its path in many Jeskai tempo decks. Ondu War Cleric became a common bomb in Oath of the Gatewatch drafts. Soulfire Grandmaster even saw some play as a 1 or 2 of in both standard and modern decks. Of course, out of all of these 2-drops, the best is Duskwatch Recruiter. With 2 sides both benefiting a creature-based strategy, the Werebear was played in practically every standard collected company deck. Another creature as powerful, if not even more so, is Sylvan Advocate. Even though Collected Company is no longer legal in Standard, both Duskwatch Recruiter and Sylvan Advocate have set a new level for 2-drop creatures. That brings us to the Grizzly Bears of today. It's surprising how powerful and relevant they've become. As a matter of fact, Red finally got its first bear with no drawbacks in the form of Falconwrath Reaver from Eldritch Moon. So who knows what the next sets will bring. We hope this video brought you a new perspective to the game. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and check out our other videos. Thanks for watching, and we look forward to seeing you again.